have a smile that people remember. I know this because they tell me, sometimes years later, at retirement ceremonies, at funerals, at the grocery store when someone recognizes me out of uniform. Chief Caldwell, I remember the first time I saw you smile. You were at my academy graduation. Or, you smiled at me once when I was having the worst week of my career, and I never forgot it. People talk about my smile the way they talk about weather that surprised them. Something unexpected, something that stayed with them longer than it should have. The smile is real. I want to be clear about that. It is not a politician's smile, not a performance. It is the smile of a woman who grew up in the West End of Atlanta and who found reasons to smile through things that would have broken other people, and who learned early that the smile is not weakness. The smile is strategy. The smile is the thing that makes people underestimate you right up until the moment they understand they've made a catastrophic error. My name is Dorothy Caldwell. I am 40 years old. I am the Chief of Police of the Atlanta Police Department, the youngest person to hold this position in the department's history, the first woman and the first Black woman. I have held this position for 3 years and 7 months, and in that time, I have dealt with budget crises, a federal oversight inquiry, 2 officer-involved shootings, a pandemic surge in violent crime, and more political pressure than I care to quantify. I thought I had seen everything. I had not seen everything. What I saw on a Tuesday evening in March, from the window of my department-issued SUV, changed everything I thought I understood about the department I was running. It didn't show me something new. It showed me something that had been there the whole time, and that I had been, in my own way, choosing not to see. Let me start from the beginning. Let me start from the thing that started me. The Tuesday evening in March was not the beginning, though it felt like it. The beginning was probably years earlier, in the accumulation of small things that I had filed under systemic issues requiring long-term reform, rather than this is happening right now in front of my face. The beginning was in the pattern that I had been looking at on paper for 3 years, without understanding what I was actually looking at. The data was clear if you knew how to read it, and I knew how to read it, because reading data is what I do. I have an MBA and a law degree and 20 years in law enforcement, and a particular way of looking at numbers that strips them of their abstraction and turns them back into people. The numbers told me this. In the Vine City, English Avenue, and Mechanicsville precincts, the arrest rates for what we call low-level street contact, stop-and-question interactions that result in a citation or custody, ran at approximately 340% above department average. The racial composition of those arrests was not surprising, given the demographics of those neighborhoods. What was surprising was something more specific. When I broke the data down by address, not just neighborhood but individual block, a pattern emerged that I couldn't explain with demographics alone. In areas where residents of mixed economic status shared streets, gentrifying blocks where new condominiums sat next to older housing, the arrest rate differential between what my department's data classified as high-stability residences and transient or low-income residences was extreme. Not elevated, extreme. 8 to 1. 8 times more likely to be arrested if you were poor on a block that had also rich people on it. I sat with that number for 3 weeks. I showed it to my deputy chief, Marcus Webb, who had been a cop for 26 years and who looked at it and said, "Chief, that tracks with the complaint data we've been seeing." And I looked at Marcus and thought, we've been seeing it. For how long have we been seeing it and filing it as a pattern requiring long-term reform instead of a crisis requiring immediate intervention? The Tuesday evening in March, I was in my SUV being driven back to headquarters from a community meeting in Vine City when I saw it happen. A stop. 2 of my officers, patrol car pulled to the curb on Joseph E. Boone Boulevard, a man on the sidewalk. Standard. Routine. The kind of contact that happens 800 times a day in Atlanta, and that most people, most officers, don't think twice about. But I was watching, and I'd been watching with different eyes than I used to have, and I saw things I couldn't unsee. The man on the sidewalk was in his 60s. He was black. He was wearing a heavy coat that had seen better decades and carrying 2 plastic bags. His posture was the posture of someone who has been stopped by police before and has learned exactly how to make himself small enough to be released quickly. Head slightly down, hands visible, voice quiet. The officers were in their mid-30s, white patrol uniforms. One of them, Officer First Class Carter, his nameplate caught the light from a passing car, I know his name now, stood with his hand on his belt and his chin angled in the particular way that signals someone who believes they are performing authority rather than exercising it. The interaction lasted 11 minutes. I know because I timed it on my phone. At the end of 11 minutes, the man was put in cuffs. His bags were searched on the sidewalk. He was placed in the back of the patrol car. I pulled out my own phone and checked the incident log that my position gives me live access to. Male, black, 63, trespassing complaint from adjacent property, open warrant, traffic citation, outstanding. An open warrant for an unpaid traffic ticket, 11 minutes, handcuffs, sidewalk search. 3 weeks earlier, 2 blocks away, a woman in a Lululemon jacket had been stopped for a broken taillight. The interaction lasted 4 minutes. She was sent on her way with a fix-it citation and a have a nice evening. Her outstanding parking tickets, 3 of them I checked, went unremarked upon. I sat in the back of my SUV and my driver asked if I was all right, and I said yes, and I meant no. Here is what I want to say about my anger, because it matters, and because I have spent years being told that my anger is my problem, rather than a reasonable response to unreasonable circumstances. I am, as I said, very angry. I have been very angry for most of my adult life, and the anger has been both the engine and the liability of my career. It drove me through the academy when my instructors found reasons to be difficult. It carried me through 12 years on patrol and investigations when colleagues found ways to make it clear that my presence was tolerated and not welcomed. It pushed me through the politics of the command structure and the indignity of being passed over twice for promotions that went to men with fewer qualifications and lighter skin, until the 3rd time when the mayor's office decided that the optics had shifted and that having me in the chief's office was a benefit rather than a risk. My anger is not irrational. It is the accumulated product of 40 years of clear-eyed observation of how the world works. But anger without discipline is just fire without direction. I learned that the hard way in my 30s, when I nearly ended my career by saying in a department meeting, with 15 people present and 2 of them recording, exactly what I thought about the handling of a complaint from a community member that my division chief had described as not a priority at this time. I said what I thought in terms that were precise and accurate and professionally catastrophic, and it cost me 6 months of remediation and a note in my file that followed me for 3 years. I learned to hold the anger differently, not to eliminate it. I've never believed in eliminating it, never wanted to become someone who had smoothed out all the edges that made me dangerous, but to contain it, to channel it, to use it like a lens rather than a torch. On the Tuesday evening in March, watching the patrol car pull away with the 63-year-old man in the back seat, I felt the anger the way I always feel it, cold and precise and clarifying. And I made a decision. I was going to find out exactly what my officers were doing when they thought no one important was watching. The idea came to me fully formed, which sometimes happens when the anger is cold enough. I had been running the department for 3 years. I had implemented 4 major policy initiatives and 2 systemic reform programs. I had sat in 1,000 community meetings and heard 1,000 variations of the same story. Your officers treat us differently. They don't see us as people. It depends on how we look and where we live. I had listened. I had promised. I had built programs. And none of it had gotten to the root of what I'd seen on Joseph E. Boone Boulevard, because the root was not policy. The root was in the gap between what officers did when they knew they were being observed and what they did when they believed they were not. I needed to be unobservable. The most unobservable person in any American city, in any American neighborhood, in any interaction with law enforcement, is a black woman who looks poor. She is so invisible that she might as well not exist. She is so invisible that the systems designed to protect people will look right through her. I had spent 20 years making myself visible in every room I walked into. I was about to do the opposite. I told 3 people. My deputy chief, Marcus, who looked at me for a long time and then said, "With respect, Chief, this is either the best idea you've ever had or the worst." I told my assistant, Renata, who was the only person in the building I trusted with my schedule and my safety. And I told Detective Lieutenant Yvonne Patterson from Internal Affairs, who I needed because if I was going inside my own department's operational territory as a civilian, I needed someone who knew where I was. I told no one else. I spent 1 week preparing. I went to Goodwill twice, not the Goodwill near my condo in Buckhead, where someone might recognize me, but one in Mableton. And I bought clothes that fit the story I was building. A heavy coat, dark-colored, the kind that absorbs cold and smell, and the particular exhaustion of outdoor living. Pants that had been mended at the knee. Shoes that were 1 size too large, which changes how you walk in a way that is immediately readable to anyone paying attention. A scarf. A bag. Not a tote. Not a purse. But a reusable grocery bag of the kind that accumulates in quantity when you're carrying your life. I had a makeup artist colleague. She worked with the department's forensic imaging unit and had helped me with disguise elements in 2 previous undercover operations, who altered my appearance in ways that were specific and deliberate. Not a dramatic transformation. That's not how it works. The goal is not to look like a different person. The goal is to look like a person that people have already decided is not worth looking at twice. She darkened the area under my eyes. She altered my hair. Pulled back. Covered. Without the specific care I give it every morning. She removed my jewelry, my watch, the small markers of status that are so constant for me I've stopped noticing them. I looked at myself in the mirror when she was done and I felt something unexpected. Not discomfort. Recognition. This was not a stranger's face. This was a face I knew. The face of women I'd grown up with. Women in my family. Women who took 3 buses to work and carried groceries home at night, and who the world had decided were background. I'd spent 20 years moving away from that face, and here it was, looking back at me. I took a breath. I kept my smile. I always keep my smile. It is mine, and I will not give it up for any role. And I walked out into Atlanta. The first 2 days were orientation. I need to be honest about this. The first 2 days were disorienting in a way I had not prepared for, because I had prepared logically, and the experience was not logical. It was physical. It was cellular. I spent time in the areas my data had flagged. Vine City primarily, with time in English Avenue, moving through the corridors where the data showed elevated stop rates. I sat on benches. I stood outside a shelter on Joseph E. Boone. I walked. I was on my feet for 9 hours both days, and by evening my feet hurt in the particular way that feet hurt when the shoes are wrong and the pavement is relentless. Nobody bothered me. That was the first lesson. The invisibility was not theoretical. In 2 days of moving through areas with high police presence, I was not stopped once. I was not questioned. I was looked through by officers who I could name, whose personnel files I had read, whose evaluations I had signed. The invisibility was almost the most disturbing part. Almost. On the 3rd day, I was sitting on the steps of a closed barbershop on Donald Lee Hollowell Parkway, mid-afternoon, eating a sandwich I'd bought from a convenience store, when a patrol car slowed alongside the curb. 2 officers. I knew both of them by name. Officer First Class Ryan Carter, the same officer I'd watched on Joseph E. Boone 3 weeks earlier, and his partner, Officer Dana Reeves. Carter got out of the car. I watched him approach with the specific walk that I've seen on every person in authority, who has decided in advance that the person they're approaching is not worth the courtesy of assuming good faith. Unhurried, chin up, hand loose near the belt, the walk of someone performing confidence for an audience that doesn't exist. "What are you doing here?" he said. Not a question. A statement that wanted to be a question. "Eating my lunch," I said. I kept my voice quiet and my eyes down. Not submissive, just below the register that invites escalation. I've watched enough of these interactions to know the sonic range that keeps things from accelerating. You live around here? I stay at the shelter on Joseph E. Boone. You got ID? I had ID. I had carefully prepared ID. A state ID in a different name. Dorothy Mae Carson, 40 years old. An address that would verify as a real building in a real neighborhood, backed by documentation my department's IA unit had helped create. Everything legitimate. Everything legal. Everything that should have resolved this interaction in 30 seconds. I handed it to him. He took it and went back to the car, and I sat on the steps and finished my sandwich and watched the pigeons on the sidewalk and waited. He was in the car for 11 minutes, same number as before. I don't think it was a coincidence. I think 11 minutes is how long it takes for him to run the check and deliberate and decide, which means that for 11 minutes I sat on public steps on a public sidewalk, eating a legal sandwich and waited for a man 15 years my junior and 2 career rungs below me to decide whether I was permitted to continue existing in that space. He came back with my ID and a look on his face that I recognized. It was the look of a man who has run the check and found nothing actionable, and who is annoyed by this because he had expected to find something. Shelters got rules about alcohol, he said. Not relevant, not connected to anything that had happened. Just a statement, lobbed into the space between us like a stone. I don't drink, I said. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at the sandwich wrapper on the step beside me. Clean that up when you leave, he said. And he got back in the car and drove away. I sat with that for a while. Not the rudeness of it. I've been spoken to with greater rudeness by people who should have known better, and I have a thick skin that has been engineered specifically to resist that particular instrument. I sat with the precision of it, the way he had found the one small thing available to him and deployed it, not as information, not as actual law enforcement, but as a reminder of the power differential. Clean that up when you leave. As if the wrapper were the point. As if the wrapper were anything except a prop in a performance of authority for an audience of one woman who he believed had no recourse. I was already thinking about what was coming. The 4th day is when things got complicated, in the way that things always get complicated when you leave the clean lines of a plan and enter the actual world. Her name was Tamara. I never learned her last name. She was 54 years old. She told me this with a matter-of-factness that suggested she'd stop being surprised by how the arithmetic of her life added up. She had been unhoused for 8 months, since her sister's apartment, where she'd been staying after a medical situation that had cost her her job, had been condemned following a burst pipe. She had 2 adult children in College Park. She called them on Sundays from the library. She had a library card. She sat down next to me on the bench outside the day center on Northside Drive where I'd been spending my afternoons, and she asked if I was new, and I said yes, and she handed me half of her granola bar without being asked, which is a gesture I will not forget. We talked for 2 hours. She told me things about the neighborhood, about which officers were decent and which ones weren't, about the specific geography of street harassment that had reshaped her daily routes into a complex avoidance map. She said, "You learn which blocks have which ones, the ones you have to plan around." "Which ones?" I said. "The ones who pull up and just start asking. No reason, just they see you and they decide." She said it without particular heat, the way you talk about weather. The young ones are the worst. They want to prove something. The older ones sometimes leave you alone. "What do they want to prove?" I asked. She looked at me sideways. "That they run this. That this is their space, and you're in it by their permission." She finished the other half of her granola bar. "You ever been stopped?" "Yesterday," I said. She nodded like I'd confirmed something. "How'd it go?" He told me to clean up my sandwich wrapper. She laughed, a short, sharp laugh that contained everything. "Oh, you got a clean one. One time last winter, one of them took my coat. said it matched the description of one reported stolen. She paused. It was 42 degrees. I felt the anger move through me like a current. "What happened?" I said. He gave it back after 20 minutes. Cold 20 minutes. She shrugged with the specific resignation of someone who has learned to metabolize injustice because the alternative is to be consumed by it. I filed a complaint. You know what happened with that. I knew what happened with that. I'd read the complaint data. Nothing, I said. Nothing fast, she corrected. Then a letter, 3 months later, said the investigation found no policy violation. She looked at me. "What's your name?" "Dorothy," I said. "Dorothy." She tried it out. "You seem like you're thinking hard about something." "I am," I said. "Don't think too hard," she said. "Out here you got to stay present." That was the best advice anyone gave me the entire time I was under. Day 6 was the day everything went wrong, and the day I learned something about myself that I hadn't expected to learn. I was on Auburn Avenue, late afternoon, the light going golden the way it does in Atlanta in March before it drops cold and fast. I was walking. I walked almost everywhere during those days, partly for the data gathering and partly because moving was easier than being still, easier than sitting with the weight of what I was accumulating. A call came over the radio that I was monitoring through an earpiece so small it was invisible. Disturbance call, Auburn Avenue, male subject, agitated behavior. A domestic noise complaint had escalated per the caller's description. The officers who responded were ones I'd been watching. Carter again, and a second car with 2 officers I'll call Michaels and Thornton, because their full names are part of a still active IA investigation, and I won't compromise that. 4 officers total, 2 cars, 1 call about an agitated man. The man was standing outside an apartment building. He was black, mid-40s, wearing a work uniform. He'd clearly just come off a shift, and he was arguing on the phone. Not fighting, not threatening, not anything that matched the description in the dispatch call. Arguing on the phone in the particular emphatic way that people argue when they're frustrated and tired, and the person on the other end of the call is not getting it. I stopped half a block away. I watched. What happened in the next 20 minutes I am going to describe as accurately as I can, because accuracy is what I owe to this story, and to the man whose name I subsequently learned was James Warren, 46 years old, HVAC technician, 14 years of employment with the same company, no criminal record, 3 kids in the Decatur school system. The officers approached him before he'd even registered the cars. Carter put his hand on James Warren's shoulder, not as a greeting, not as a neutral contact, but as a claim. The claim of someone who has decided in advance that this body is subject to their authority. James Warren turned. He said something. I was close enough to hear his voice, but not the words. The tone was clear. Confusion, then the specific wariness of a black man in America who has just noticed he's surrounded by 4 police officers and is rapidly recalibrating every instinct toward survival. Carter said something. James Warren said something back. And I watched Carter's body language shift in the way that I have seen 1,000 times in 1,000 training videos and incident reviews. The escalation that comes not from the civilian, but from the officer. The specific posture that says I have decided this is going to go a certain way before the civilian has had a chance to make it go any way at all. Michaels moved to James Warren's left, Thornton to his right. I was moving before I consciously decided to move. This is where the anger did what it has always done, which is arrive faster than the thinking. I had taken 11 steps toward the situation before the thinking caught up and grabbed the anger by the collar and said, "No, not like this. If you walk in as Chief Caldwell right now, you will rescue 1 man from 1 incident, and Carter will have a bad week, and in 6 months nothing will have changed. Think." I stopped. The thinking was right. The anger was right too. It was responding to a real thing, a real injustice, a real man being backed against a wall by 4 officers for arguing on a phone on a public sidewalk. Both were right, and they were pulling in opposite directions. And I stood on Auburn Avenue in the golden March light, and I made a choice. I pulled out my phone. I started recording. I want to talk about what it cost me to stand there and record instead of intervening. I want to talk about it because I think people imagine that being a chief of police insulates you from the feelings of watching injustice happen in front of you, and I want to disabuse you of that notion completely. I stood 20 feet away, and I watched James Warren get handcuffed. I watched him search for the composure that a man who has been through this before knows he needs to find immediately. I watched him find it, that specific, terrible practice stillness, and I watched the officers read that stillness as compliance and call it a victory. His charge was obstruction. He had, per Carter's incident report, which I read that same night, failed to comply with lawful orders and exhibited behavior consistent with intoxication. He was not intoxicated. The toxicology report would subsequently confirm this. He had been arguing on a phone about a custody disagreement with his ex-wife. The call was still active when he was cuffed, and the ex-wife, who I spoke to 3 weeks later, told me she could hear everything through the phone until it dropped to the pavement. The cost of standing there was something I'm going to carry for a long time. I need you to understand that the recording I made, and the subsequent investigation it supported, and the systemic changes that followed, were worth it. I need you to understand that it was the right choice, and I also need you to be honest with yourself. The right choice is not the same as the easy choice, and the right choice is not the same as the choice that cost nothing. The cost was James Warren in handcuffs on Auburn Avenue for something that was not a crime. I'm still paying it. I stayed under for 3 more days after the Auburn Avenue incident. I want to be honest that I didn't stay because I needed more evidence. I had enough evidence by day 6 to justify a full internal affairs investigation and departmental review. I stayed because I wasn't ready to leave. Tamara and I ate dinner together twice at the day center on Northside Drive. She told me about her daughter, who was a nurse. She showed me a photograph on her phone, a young woman in scrubs, arms around an older patient, a smile that reminded me of something I couldn't quite place. She told me she had a plan. She was working with a case manager. She was 4 months on a waiting list for transitional housing. She was holding on to the plan the way you hold on to something in deep water. Not because you're sure it will save you, but because letting go is not an option. On my last day under, I was walking back toward the shelter in the early evening when a patrol car came slowly down the block and the window came down, and Carter was driving. He looked at me. I looked at him. He drove on. Something in that look stayed with me. Not malice, or not only malice. Something else. Tiredness. The specific fatigue of a man doing a job in a way that is costing him something he can't quite name, in a system that rewards the behavior he's exhibiting and calls it effective policing. I am not asking you to feel sympathy for Ryan Carter. I am asking you to understand that what I saw in his face in that moment was a human being who had made choices inside a structure that shaped those choices, and that the structure was mine to change. That was the last thing I needed to understand. I came back to headquarters on a Friday morning. Renata looked at me when I walked in and said nothing. She had perfected over 4 years of working with me the specific skill of responding to the unexpected with absolute composure, and brought me coffee and closed the door. I sat in my office for 45 minutes. I looked at the photographs on my wall, the mayor's handshake when I was sworn in, the academy class photo from 20 years ago, the community events, the commendations, the paper record of a career. Then I opened my computer and I started writing. What I wrote was not a press release. It was not an internal memo. It was an accountability document, a precise, detailed account of what I had witnessed, what I had recorded, what the data showed, and what was going to change. I wrote it in the language of policy and procedure, because that is the language of systems, and systems are what I can actually alter. I called Marcus Webb. I called the IA division chief. I called the deputy mayor for public safety. I did not call the officers' union representative first, which was not required and which I knew would be noted. I arranged a command staff meeting for the following Monday, and then I did something I had not planned to do. I called James Warren. He answered on the second ring. He was guarded in the way that people are guarded when an unknown number calls them with something official in its voice. I told him my name and my title. There was a silence. "You're the chief," he said. "Yes." "Why are you calling me?" "Because I witnessed what happened to you on Auburn Avenue," I said. "And I want to tell you that an investigation has been opened, and I want to tell you something else." Another silence. "What?" "I was there," I said. "I was 20 feet away. I was on foot. I was not in uniform." A pause. "I was dressed as a homeless woman, because I was investigating how my officers treat people who don't look like they have power." The silence this time was longer. "You were there," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." "And you watched them put handcuffs on me?" "Yes." I waited for the anger. I deserved the anger. What came instead was something I hadn't expected. A long exhale, the kind that comes from somewhere deep, from the place where you've been holding something for too long. "Was it worth it?" he said. "Me getting locked up. Was it worth the investigation?" "I'm going to spend the rest of my career making sure it was," I said. "That's not an answer. I know that. I'm telling you what I can give you, which is everything I have, starting now." He didn't say anything for a moment. "My daughter saw the arrest," he said. "She was in the window. She's 9. I closed my eyes. "I know," I said, because I had read the incident report thoroughly, and it had been in there, one line among many. Witness, juvenile female, approximately 9 years of age, in second-floor window of adjacent residence. "She asked me if I did something wrong," he said. "She asked if I was a bad person." "What did you tell her?" "I told her no. I told her I didn't do anything wrong." A pause. "She asked why they took me then. I didn't know what to say." The anger was cold and clarifying. I felt it all the way through. "Tell her that sometimes the people in charge of protecting people don't do their job right," I said. "And tell her that when that happens, the people in charge of the people who do the job wrong are supposed to fix it." A breath. "And tell her that this time, they're going to." Another long silence. "I want to believe that," he said. "I know," I said. "I'm going to earn it." The command staff meeting on Monday was the most difficult professional conversation of my career, and I have had some very difficult professional conversations. I walked in without my usual opener. I usually begin these meetings with something brief that sets tone, sometimes a story, sometimes a number, sometimes just a statement of purpose. I walked in and I sat down and I put a printed photograph in the center of the table. It was me, the photograph Renata had taken on day 2, before I'd fully settled into the role, a surveillance-style image taken from across the street. A black woman in a heavy coat, canvas bag on her arm, sitting on steps outside a closed storefront. None of them recognized me. I watched their faces, and none of them recognized me. "That's me," I said. "That was taken 6 days ago. I was undercover in Vine City and English Avenue for 9 days. The silence in the room was of a specific quality that I have heard before, and that I find, despite everything, somewhat satisfying. It is the silence of a room full of people who are rapidly recalibrating. I laid out what I had found, the recordings, the data, the patterns, the specific incidents, including Auburn Avenue, including the interactions I had personally experienced, including Tamara's coat, which had become part of the IA investigation record, and James Warren's 9-year-old daughter in the window. Marcus Webb looked at me when I was done and said, "What do you want to do, Chief?" "Everything," I said. "I want to do everything. I mean that. I know how it sounds, ambitious, naive, the kind of statement that gets qualified by realities and resources and politics until it becomes something smaller and more manageable. I know how institutional change actually works, which is slowly, incompletely, through iteration and failure and revision. I said it anyway. Because the alternative to everything is accepting that James Warren's daughter will grow up asking the same question that her father couldn't answer. And that is not acceptable to me. It is simply not acceptable. Officer First Class Ryan Carter was placed on administrative leave pending investigation the following Tuesday. His partner, Michaels and Thornton, were both referred for review. The investigation identified 8 additional incidents over 18 months that fit the same pattern. Carter's union rep requested a meeting with me. I agreed to the meeting. I want to tell you about this meeting because Carter's union rep said something that I've thought about every day since, and because I think honesty requires me to share it. He was a man named Ed Garrity, 61, a former officer, and he sat across from me and made the expected arguments: procedural fairness, due process, the challenges of policing high-crime areas under resource constraints. I listened to all of it. And then he said something unexpected. He said, "Chief, Carter grew up in a department where this is how you survived, where the metrics they measured you on rewarded exactly what you watched him do. You built this, your predecessors built this, and now you're holding one guy accountable for what the whole system told him was success." He wasn't wrong. I sat with that for a long time after he left. The anger was still there, clean and cold and pointing precisely at the right things. But it had more space around it now. Space for the complicated truth that individuals operate inside systems, and that accountability for individuals and accountability for systems are not either-or propositions, but both, and ones. Carter needed to be accountable. The system needed to change. Both things, simultaneously, without using one to excuse the other. He returned to active duty 7 months later, after completing a mandatory program and with enhanced supervision and a permanent record notation. He will not be the officer he was before. I intend to make sure of that. Whether he becomes the officer he could be, that I cannot guarantee. That is his work to do. There are things I changed in those first 6 months that I will tell you about because they matter. Body camera policy, mandatory activation at all pedestrian contact regardless of apparent severity, with supervisory review of a random 15% of footage monthly. This is more than most departments. I know it is not enough. A community accountability board with real investigative authority, not advisory capacity, actual authority, over the IA process. It has civilian members, including 2 people who have been unhoused in Atlanta within the past 3 years. Tamara is not on the board because I respect her privacy, but I spoke with her about its formation. She said, "Make sure they actually have power, not just a seat." I made sure. Performance metrics for patrol officers, revised to deprioritize citation and arrest volume in favor of community interaction quality, assessed through multiple measures including, and this was the one that got the most pushback, direct feedback from the civilians who interacted with the officers. Anonymous, structured, analyzed quarterly. Mandatory implicit bias training, which I know everyone has. What I changed was who delivers it. It is now delivered in partnership with community organizations, with mandatory participation from command staff, including me, and with required reflection components that go beyond the performative. And James Warren. I personally reviewed his case. The obstruction charge was dismissed. His arrest record was expunged. I met with his attorney and with the city's legal department, and with the mayor's office, to make sure that the expungement was complete and properly documented. I met with James Warren twice, once formally, with his attorney present, and once informally, at his request, at a diner in Decatur. He brought his daughter. Her name is Kayla. She is 9 years old and she has her father's eyes, and the specific seriousness of a child who has been paying attention to the world around her and finding it more complicated than she'd hoped. She looked at me across the table, at my face, at my clothes, at my badge, and she said, "Are you really the boss of the police?" "Yes," I said. "Then why did they take my dad?" I looked at her and I thought about all the careful, policy-appropriate, systemically accurate answers I could give, and I chose none of them. Because they made a mistake. I said. And their boss, me, didn't know they were making it. And when I found out, I made sure it stopped. Did they get in trouble? She asked. Yes, I said. Good, she said, and picked up her milkshake with the absolute moral clarity of a 9-year-old who has decided the case is closed. James Warren looked at me over the top of her head with an expression that I'm not going to try to describe, because some things don't translate into words, and this was one of them. I want to talk about Tamara, because this story isn't just mine. She got into transitional housing in June, 4 months after I came out from under. I found out because Renata, who I had asked to quietly track the case, not to interfere, just to watch, told me one morning. I did not intervene in the process. I did not use my position. I want to be clear about this because the line between help and interference is one I think about carefully. And because Tamara deserved to get housing, because she was on the list, and she had been working with her case manager, and she had been doing everything right. Not because the chief of police made a call. I visited her in September, out of uniform, driving my own car, not my department vehicle. She was in a 1-bedroom in Mechanicsville, small and clean, and hers. She had a photograph of her daughter in scrubs on the refrigerator. She made me coffee, and she looked at me across the kitchen table, the same way she'd looked at me on the bench on Northside Drive. And she said, I thought you were something that first day. Something like what? Something more than you were letting on. She smiled. I didn't know what exactly, but you were too present. Out here you either get absent real fast or you were never really here. She poured more coffee. You were always here. I have thought about that observation many times since. You were always here. I was always here. Underneath the badge and the position and the anger and the career and the smile and the 20 years of making myself visible in rooms that tried to make me invisible, I was always the woman from the West End who grew up watching which people the system served and which people they didn't, and who chose to spend her life working inside the machine because someone had to, and who spent 9 days in worn shoes and a heavy coat and no jewelry learning that the machine still needed a lot more work. I am doing the work. I am going to keep doing the work. That is all I know how to tell you. 3 years ago, I stood in the city council chamber, and I was sworn in as chief of police, and the mayor put his hand on my shoulder and said something about history being made, and I smiled the smile that people remember, and I thought, this is the beginning, not the destination. I still believe that. The past 11 months have not shaken that belief. They have deepened it, made it heavier and more expensive and more necessary. My department has a lot of work left to do. I have a lot of work left to do. Carter and Michaels and Thornton are not the whole story. They are 3 individuals in a department of thousands. And the work of changing what those thousands are measured by and rewarded for, and trained to do, is a long work, and an unfinished one. The anger is still there. It has always been there. It will always be there. And I've stopped apologizing for it. What I have learned, what 9 days in worn shoes on concrete taught me, is that the anger is most useful when it is in service of something specific and achievable and true. James Warren's daughter can grow up knowing that when someone in authority made a mistake at her father's expense, someone else in authority made it right. That is specific and achievable and true. Tamara has a kitchen. That is specific and achievable and true. The complaint board has real power. That is specific and achievable and true. I am not done. I am not close to done. But I am here, and I am present, and I am working. And the door to my office is open, which is new, and the Community Accountability Board met last week for the 3rd time, which is new, and Officer Ryan Carter has had 3 positive community interaction evaluations in a row, which is something I did not expect, and which I am cautiously noting. The work continues. If you listened to this story today, whether it made you angry or sad or hopeful, or some combination of all 3 that doesn't have a name, I want you to know that the anger is allowed. The anger is appropriate. What you do with it is the question. What you build with it, brick by brick, from the ground up, is the answer. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Tell me about the injustice you've seen. Tell me about the door that nobody was guarding. I will read every word. Until next time.